Ladies and gentlemen, it's very good to see a room filling up this quickly and this early before one of our presentations. My name is Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director for Future Conflict and Cybersecurity here at IISS, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this meeting. It's customary at this point to say that our speaker needs no introduction, but perhaps in this case that's not entirely appropriate, not because our speaker is not eminently distinguished, he very clearly is, but rather because the topic that he is addressing of space is one where I think very few people appreciate the extent to which it now impacts on our daily lives. Nor, indeed, the extent to which the United Kingdom has quietly, over time, become a major player in this domain. But that is indeed the case. And I'm delighted that we've got Professor Sir Martin Sweeting, the Executive Chairman of Surrey Satellite Technologies Limited, one of the great success stories of the British space industry, to talk to us about these issues. Professor Sweeting's presentation will be entirely on the record. He will speak for some 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for question and answers. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see some friendly faces, well, hopefully friendly faces, some recognisable faces in the audience. I'm very aware that we have somewhat of a mixed audience, and in that audience there are some experts on space. What I thought I would do for this discussion was to start out, as has been suggested, with sort of half an hour's quick picture of space, its importance, what we're doing in the UK, and then throw up a few questions. And really, perhaps the most valuable part of this session will be in the discussions, and I hope that you will throw up your awkward questions, which I will do my best to answer. So, by way of setting the scene, as has been just mentioned, the use of space is expanding very rapidly, certainly over the last decade or so. It has become an essential part of our infrastructure. It forms considerable input to our national economy, our well-being and security, covers such areas as communications, both civil and military, timing and positioning, again, ubiquitous, both in commerce, in our daily lives, driving around the towns, and of course in supporting positioning in military and security aspects. Of course, it's also used for looking at how we best use our resources in agriculture, for example, and for helping us understand and mitigate the effects of natural and unfortunately man-made disasters. It's widely used in our everyday lives. I think there was a discussion we had a year or two back, what would happen if we switched off space for a while. The conclusion was that probably would lead to civil unrest within a fortnight, simply because our society is now very much tuned to just-in-time delivery of goods, food. Our utilities are dependent on space and banking, and so if we were to switch that off, we would be very seriously hampered. There are, I hasten to add, alternative means for doing some of these things, but I think we would find it extremely difficult to switch to those very rapidly. So why is space important to the UK, other than in those topics that I just outlined? Well, space is being used to address a number of the key challenges that the UK faces. We have a growing and an aging population, and so we need to be able to support those communities. We want to increase the pace and the reach of technology, so we want to make sure that everybody in the communities can participate in using space, both for their private pleasure, but also for creating wealth, economic growth through new businesses, And of course, we need still to understand the best use of natural resources and try to understand the effects of climate change and environmental impacts and how we should deal with those. Last, of course, but not least, and very relevant to this discussion, is the use of space in support of global security and addressing the threats of terrorism. So space, just by introduction, to put it into context in the UK, is vital for the UK. It's been identified as one of the UK's 8 great technologies and is a major growth sector in the UK, achieving something between 7 to 10%. The figures seem to vary when I listen to different reports on this, but in the order of 7 to 10% year-on-year real growth. This is about 4 times the economic national average. It employs around about 80,000 people in the UK and contributes about 11 billion into the economy. So it's a surprising amount, considering how little most people are aware of the role of space in the UK. We're aiming to create another 100,000 jobs and increase that 11 billion to about 40 billion in the next 20 years. So there are some quite ambitious targets for the space industry. And space has been and continues to be a driver of innovation, not just in technology but also in applications and increasingly in business. So the UK's space strategy has been developed and has actually changed dramatically in the last 5 to 6 years, primarily through an activity which was to study innovation and growth strategy for space in the UK. So I forget the date when it started, but it was sometime around about 2008, 9 or thereabouts. Industry, academia, business, and most importantly HNG, both departments of, including Treasury, as well as our colleagues in MOD. Treasury, of course, being perhaps the most important one to discuss things with at that time, studied the role of space and what was the importance and contribution of space into the UK interests. And the short result of that, and you can always look for the documentation on the web, it's freely available, very interesting and detailed report, complete with economic analysis behind it for those of you that enjoy figures. But the realization was that the UK actually is really a critical contributor to the economy and also to our national sort of well-being and security. And as a result of this, UK expenditure and investment in space went up probably by almost a factor of 5. And indeed, our contributions, as a measure of this, our contributions to the European Space Agency, we went, I think, from something like 9th up to 3rd after France and Germany and above Italy. And there are a number of initiatives, including establishing a space hub at Harwell and the establishment of an applications development centre called a Catapult, which was to essentially try to drive the applications and link the manufacturing and upstream end of space to the applications and utility in the downstream, and to stimulate new interests. And this has been remarkably successful in attracting SMEs to come in and have access to space data and see what they can develop in terms of value-added products. So this is a sort of a focus now for space. There's many other areas of activity around the UK, of course, in space in universities and companies, but this is a focus which helps perhaps stimulate new applications. Of course, there is a considerable activity in defence and security. The independent military SATCOM has been provided for many years through Skynet, and then more recently through the Paradigm PPP between MOD and industry. And of course, there is a very strong cooperation with our allies, and particularly with the United States, on exchange of information. But it is interesting to note that the UK to date has no sovereign observation capability, and that whilst we have, of course, and to benefit from a lot of the exchanges with our allies, we don't have any independent observation capability. I'll address that a little bit further in the future in a moment. Of course, space has been the high ground for military and security affairs for many years. This is not a great surprise, but the UK is very much dependent on satellites for the communications and timing, as I've mentioned, but surveillance, meteorology, missile warning, intelligence gathering, situational awareness, and it's very good to see that actually there has been an increased appreciation, I think, within defence circles of the importance of space and how the UK perhaps should increase its involvement. And for the first time, space was mentioned some years ago in the FATOC, and also some of the recent studies indicate that almost 90% of military capabilities have direct dependence on space-based capabilities. Now, the UK, one of the reasons is why should the UK have an independent observation capability? The UK, as a relatively small country, is very well surveyed by Ordnance Survey. However, the data for this, there are a large number of updates per day to Ordnance Survey. The environment is continually changing, and we do need to have a timely monitoring assessment of a number of civil risks, particularly in flooding. This is something that's come, I think, to the fore in recent years, especially in rural areas. The most effective use of land for agriculture, and increasingly the implications on biodiversity from urban development, a topic that's actually quite hot in the press at the moment. But we do have interests overseas, of course. We distribute a considerable amount of aid to countries in need, and we need to both assess how that aid is being used and coordinate its use to best effect. We have a number of Crown territories which we also would like to keep an eye on and support, and of course we want to contribute to global security questions with our allies. But also I would propose that sovereign observation capability would provide us with additional knowledge in adding to that which we're provided by our allies, but also provides us with a degree of independence of action. We are able then to observe where we wish, at the times we wish, and use that to form our own opinions, knowing that the data is secure. Many government departments already use space, of course, but sometimes, actually, it turns out without really realising where the information came from, and that not really appreciating that it was actually derived from space. So some departments don't not only realise or appreciate the potential value of Earth observation in particular to achieving some of the government goals and responsibilities. And it's almost, I think, fair to say that almost all departments are concerned if they actually admitted to the fact that they use space-derived data, then their concern is that they would then end up with part of the bill. A very natural reaction, of course, but not necessarily entirely productive. So part of the activity over the last year or so has been to try to raise the profile of space and its applications and its value into departments. And the government chief scientific advisor, Smart Warport, commissioned the Royal Society to have a look at this in terms of specifically in Earth observation. And this afternoon I'm going to focus more on Earth observation and communication. To have a look and see, well, what are the activities in observing the Earth with relevance to the UK. This was a very short study, brought together a short team of experts and produced a report. And if you wish to have a look at this, and this report covers the various aspects of observation, not just from satellites, but linking observations into other sources of observation, whether it be in situ sensors, or, oceans, and so forth. So do look that up. It's available on the Royal Society website. Again, a fairly detailed tome, but it does summarise the importance and impact of these. And it looked at this and cross-environmental observations and relevance to departments and the impacts, particularly of some of the emerging technologies linking in UAVs on various unmanned vehicles of different sizes to satellites. So we're endeavouring to try to increase the awareness within HMG of the value and use of space in a wide range of probably hitherto unrealised areas. Just to introduce myself a little bit on what I'm doing, and I, as was mentioned, I come from a small company called Surrey Satellite Technology Limited, which was founded 30 years ago. I'm not quite sure whether those 30 years disappeared, but 30 years ago, and as a spin-out from the University of Surrey. It's a small company, 500 people, about 100 million in turnover, and most of our 98% of our business is export, about $500 million of export. And we work very closely with our academic roots, looking at academic research, looking at small satellite techniques, looking ahead 20 to 30 years. And over the last 30 years, the UK has built up a very strong reputation, essentially, in pioneering small satellites. In the 1980s, when this was first mooted, small satellites were considered, I think, by those that are being polite, to be a crazy idea and of very little use. And there were certainly others with more vehement views. But over the last 30 years, small satellites have developed, and by bringing together the academic research that was carried out in the university, linking it to a university spin-out company, bringing it out into the marketplace, there's been this sort of synergy of academic research and commercial exploitation. Now, the challenges, forgive my spelling here, Hoffman, the challenges of space have often driven innovation on Earth. This is, I think, well known from the last decades. However, what we see now is actually this whole cycle turning around the other way to some extent, and the dramatic advances in terrestrial consumer electronics, and we see this in our smartphones and the like, actually now is causing a revolution in the approach to space, because we can now sensibly use commercial off-the-shelf components, carefully selected for the space environment, to be able to now create capabilities in a much smaller volume and much lower power, much lower cost than we could hitherto achieve. And so what we see is the technologies that we see in our laptops and our phones and cameras and Xboxes and all the rest of these things that we play with can be carefully selected, can be used to create very small but capable satellites. And this has completely caused a revolution in the way you approach space. New business models for commerce and new opportunities for the security community as well. And the UK really has led this through the development of a whole range of small satellites. When we talk about small satellites, it's everything from the size of a loaf of bread up to a minivan. And the examples that you see here are just going from nano satellites weighing about 5 kilos all the way up to small geostationary satellites, which don't sound terribly small at 4,000 kilos, but they are by comparison to their conventional sisters. The majority of the development in small satellites has been in the mini, micro, and nano size, and these are satellites which are essentially you go from the size of a mini down, as I say, to the size of a loaf of bread, with different applications. And of course, you can't do everything with a tiny satellite. It's horses for courses, and different applications really demand different capabilities. But the underlying important factor is small volume, so it's generally cheaper to launch and lower weight, so it's cheaper to launch. Very rapid timeframes for development and using some of the latest technology. When you consider conventional approaches to space might have a gestation period of 2 decades from the initial design through to actually being in orbit, if we can take advantage of some of the latest technologies that are developed for commercial applications and get those into orbit in 2 years, you can see the technological advantage is nearly 2 decades worth. So this is the key. Oops, wrong button. Try another button. Just to again put it into perspective, in the UK, people are surprised that perhaps we've launched 47 satellites over the last 34 years. And these are, as I mentioned earlier, 98% of this is for export, so something like 19, 20 countries. A very Catholic, with a small c, mix, as you can see, everything from the United States on the left or the west through to China in the right and on the east, and the north and south into Africa and so on. So this is a very interesting set of communities. But this has also included some very early demonstrations of small satellites for the US Air Force, for the French DVR, and also for UK MOD. So what do these satellites look like? Just to give an example, and I'm not going to go through the whole plethora of them, but the latest satellites that we launched were mini satellites. These demonstrate perhaps the peak of capability of the small, low-cost satellites. They weigh about 400 kilos, so these are biggish small satellites, and they are optical observation satellites with a native resolution of 1 meter, launched into a constellation in order that so these satellites run around chasing each other around the Earth orbit, and in this constellation it gives us more rapid revisit, so we can observe changing phenomena more quickly. But it also has created the opportunity for a new business model. I'm not sure whether you can see this, but it gives you an idea of the sort of resolutions and quality that's now possible from these small satellites. And to put that into perspective, this is the sort of performance that you get from satellites which perhaps cost 5 times the cost done conventionally over the last few years. So this is not only creating a new capability, but it is also creating a new opportunity for business models. And here, as an example, we have a system whereby we've been in Earth observation, instead of just buying the satellite or buying the data, has been emulating the business model that's being used for geostationary communication satellites, where people rent transponder time to run their, whether it's the BBC or Sky News. They don't own necessarily satellites all the time. They just rent the transponder time for the time they want it. Here we are running a similar business model for the first time in Earth observation. Giving you an example of the capabilities of these satellites, you can, if you wish, count the number of deck chairs here on the beach, so you can actually check whether some of our European colleagues are hogging the sand. But in addition to optical satellites, where we're obviously restricted by cloud cover and you cannot image at night, the UK, and this was an initiative that was started by now Lord Willits, when he was Minister of Space and everything else, was to look at how we can reduce the cost of what are normally extremely expensive satellites, which carry out synthetic aperture radar sensing, which allows us to operate at night and during cloud. And these satellites often cost between some hundreds up to $1 billion. We were looking to reduce this down to some 1/10 of that, of the order of 40 or 50 million. In order that we can make these satellites individually more affordable, we can then afford to launch them practically into constellations, and that gives us again the opportunity to increase not just the spatial and spectral resolution, but the temporal resolution, so we can image areas more rapidly. Particularly in this case, and this satellite now is due for launch in December this year, for maritime surveillance, and on board it we'll also have AIS, the automatic identification of shipping, so that you can now look across the large maritime swaths, correlate where you detect a ship, check whether its AIS is combined with that, and whether that adds up to make sense or not. And if it doesn't, if you see a ship and you don't see the AIS, or you see something where the AIS doesn't correlate to the ship pattern, you can then perhaps examine that optically with one of the high-resolution satellites, or indeed, if necessary, send out an aircraft. And this will make that identification process much more efficient. So rather than scanning up and down the oceans, we can identify where they are and which ones are of interest. I thought, and there's lots of things to talk about, I could talk the whole day on some of the future roadmaps and things of interest, but I thought I'd put in just one area, in this area of Earth observation. It's, by the way, it's always very difficult to give a talk which is illustrated by communications, because unless you have a communications terminal, there's not much you can do. Earth observation is much nicer because you can show pictures. But if we look at the future, some of the work that we're looking at, not now but in the next few years, the big challenge is, and this started out initially by considering how do we get the generation after next to the Hubble Space Telescope. So after Hubble we have the James Webb Telescope. It's about the biggest thing that you can launch in one go. And how do we look beyond that for the next step, where we need large apertures for looking deep into space, or turning around and looking at high resolution on the ground. We need apertures which can be perhaps optical, they can be radio, and hence radar, and so on. And the approach that we're pursuing is to do this with in-orbit robotic assembly, rather like Lego, smaller satellites, which are easier and cheaper to launch, and to then assemble these in orbit, but in a way where you can then disassemble them and put them into different patterns. So you can either have a sparse area array or a long baseline or however. So this is a project that we're working on with a number of our colleagues in JPL and Caltech and at the university, and hopefully going to be able to demonstrate this for the first time in a couple of years in orbit. It's very, very difficult because you very simply you need to make sure that all your mirrors are lined up, otherwise you don't get much of a picture. This is not trivial. Fortunately, JPL are looking after the mirror bit. Our job is to do the robotic in-orbit assembly. So the thing that's interesting now, though, is that with the advent of small satellites and the use of commercial off-the-shelf components, pretty well anybody or everybody has access to space. It's no longer the preserve of the superpowers or the most technically advanced nations. 3 decades ago, it was perhaps the Soviet Union and the US, then it was added by Japan and some European countries. But if we look at it now, we see that actually almost every country, with the exception of some of those in Africa, now either possess satellite or both possess satellite plus launcher capability. So the small and very capable satellites now are put relatively sophisticated space assets within the reach of virtually every nation. And actually what we see is an impending explosion, in the nicest sense, I hope. Because small satellites mean that constellations become economically practicable, and this means that we can start to look at providing different types of solutions to some of our problems, both civil and security. And just in the last year or so, there's been a number of constellation proposals, both in communications and in observation and remote sensing, which comprise hundreds, in some cases of over 1,000 nano, micro, or mini satellites. And these new so-called mega constellations are going to have a significant impact both on the increased temporal resolution and persistence of Earth observations, providing us with a different form of continuous communication. So currently we have real-time communications from geostationary satellites, but there are some disadvantages associated with the data latencies and the size of terminals that are required. Low Earth orbiting satellites in communications can provide some interesting solutions to this, particularly when you start to link low Earth orbiting satellites into 5G type terrestrial infrastructure, so you can start to set up ad hoc IP-based networks for communications. It offers opportunities both in coverage but also in resilience. This is going to affect both the land and the maritime environment, both civil and defence. There are a number of key technologies that are going to be developed, and there's a long list, of course, but probably top of these are the optical links from satellite to ground, because this will both provide a degree of privacy and security, but also support the data rates without the congestion in the RF spectrum that we're seeing. And alongside this, there's going to be a need for increased research on adaptive antennas. All of this is going to have an impact on the big data environment. Horrible word, horrible phrase, but it sums it up quite neatly, because once we start to see all these satellites generating virtually real-time coverage of what's going on around the Earth, this is going to be a colossal data set. So the management of these data sets, the extraction of the necessary information, turning that into actionable knowledge is going to be a big challenge. And this is going to be synthesizing data, which of course comes both from space but also non-space sources. There is a sort of fly in the ointment at the moment. Getting into orbit is expensive and not very regular. And so trying to improve the capability and capacity of launch and reducing the cost is going to be critical. It's critical for our business and in small satellites, but it's also critical to make sure that these systems will work and replenish the constellations when they're done. And there's been talk in the UK of a national spaceport, more than a talk, there's a plan. And there's talk of a potential national orbital launcher. The spaceport probably first will focus on tourism, but then follow, I hope, sensibly into a national launch capability for small satellites. So finally, we're going to see that this new environment of continuous, persistent, civil, high-resolution Earth observations will have an impact on military operations. They won't be able to be carried out in private as they were in the past, because the media will be able through this to have access to seeing what's going on around the world at any time. This will no doubt have relevance to how you plan and execute military operations. This is going to also require a different Earth observation data policy for this new era. We're going to have to work out how to deal with this. There's, how do we deal with shutter control? How do we take care of issues of privacy, both civil and say in the defence environment? However, there is a bit of a danger here, because these new commercial constellations, with big companies investing in thousands of satellites, it's a little bit reminiscent of the 1980s, 90s with the Iridium sort of mobile phone with the big antenna experience, where that was a bubble. It didn't work, and unfortunately, what happened then is, because that was a marketing disaster, putting it politely, the financial community and also many of the user communities were completely turned off from constellations in the first place and low Earth orbit in the second. So if you went along and talked to anybody about either of those two topics, they just didn't want to know. And it was only 15 years later, when all of that community passed away, that new folk came along, hadn't read the history books, and have now jumped into this with great enthusiasm. Now, I hope it works. I hope it is, the business models are sound. I struggle to see the return on investment for some of the commercial investors in this, but I may be wrong, but I'm not putting my $2 in. But if it doesn't, if it does implode, then it will impact the industry and it will impact the view of governments as to how it works. So there is a danger here, and I really do hope that they got it right. Finally, space may, I think, we may find in the next few years, will become dominated by non-state players, Google. When you look at Google's plans for their plethora of spacecraft observation and communications, and Google's reputation for consuming everything, and bringing this to bring together, again, complete knowledge databases, space may become very much dominated by non-state players, which is going to change the way in which we regulate space, control space, and influence it. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you very much for that masterly overview. Raises a host of issues and questions. We've got half an hour for question and answer. Can I ask that if you do raise a question, you tell us who you are, because we are recording this. I'd like to start, if I may, by raising one question that occurred to me as I was looking at your slides, which is space looks as if it's getting quite crowded. I just wonder, do you feel that we have, as a species, much less as a country, the institutional and legal underpinnings to deconflict this growing presence in space?
Well, this was a topic that, when I was thinking my 30 minutes to talk, I thought I ought to touch on, but it's sort of difficult to cover everything. Yeah, it is an issue. In fact, one of our small satellites in 1996 was hit by a piece of space debris. It was the first time that a satellite had been hit by debris, but we were able to prove what happened, because the satellite lived to tell the tale, so we were able to pinpoint the collision and the cause of it. The satellite was a satellite we built for the French Ministry of Defence, the DGR. It then turned out that the debris came from an Ariane rocket. So it was sort of, all the legal issues miraculously evaporated. But it did go to illustrate that it's a real problem. We do have to consider avoidance maneuvers on our satellites. We consider them on a weekly basis, and we have some close calls on a bi-monthly basis, and we actually have to maneuver on a 6-monthly basis. And so, it's a real issue. And the problem is that if we end up with a large number of new players in space who perhaps aren't familiar with how to keep your spacecraft safe. If those spacecraft fragment for whatever reason, because of bad design in batteries or pressurized vessels, that can then very easily cause a chain reaction. And we're not that far away from it. There have been many studies looking at this, and we need to actually reduce debris. And so part of the work that we're also doing at Surrey is active debris removal. First of all, to be able to have passive debris removal, essentially put out a parachute, get your satellite, come in and burn up quickly. The other one is to go grab it, a bit of debris, and bring it back down. But of course, this has fairly quickly people realise this is a dual-use technology, and so that raises some sensitivities.
Okay. Yes, Ben.
Ben Barry, I'm the land warfare expert here, and 10 years ago, actually, I was given a brief by some expert RAF officers about the potential of small satellites. It's very interesting to see how it's moved on. So thank you very much for that. But I think there is a big change that affects your business model, and I think it's seriously challenging you. And pending the introduction into service of a space elevator on an equatorial country, the demands of putting objects into space in terms of setback forces, and then the hostility of the environment, the hard vacuum, the hot, the cold, the electromagnetic radiation. I think for many users it's going to make putting sensor platforms on unmanned aerial vehicles much more cost effective. And for example, if one was a new country that was attempting to set up an intimate survey, particularly if it had less than perfect weather, that might be the solution that country chose to go down. I'd also observe that not only is there an increasing space debris problem, but as we wrote in the last military balance plot 1, many parties are working hard on active neutralisation of satellites in time of war. Tell me if I'm being too pessimistic, but it seems to me the environment has significantly changed in the last 10 years in terms of the competition to your business model.
Yes, I've got a lot of little questions in there which I'd love to answer. I think the short answer is I don't agree. But of course there are some real questions that have to be answered. First of all, the space environment. Actually, in low Earth orbit in particular, but it's not so bad further up, the space environment is not that hostile. The biggest challenges are not necessarily thermal or vacuum, it's the radiation. And fortunately, in low Earth orbit, there's a degree of protection from the magnetic fields, and so providing we choose the right components from the commercial off-the-shelf devices, lifetime is not an issue. Typical lifetimes are in excess of 7 to 10 years and can be longer if needed. Not much reason to make them longer, because actually what happens is your technology refresh cycle is now so fast that if you think of a 10-year-old laptop, it's a sort of limited attraction. And unfortunately, our satellite after 10 years are a limited attraction. So the space environment is not a big concern. The cost of getting into space is the pinch point, and that's why looking at new technologies, sometimes new technologies or otherwise new business approaches to getting space launch costs down, which is possible using conventional techniques, and hopefully in the longer term there will be new techniques which will do it even better. But in the medium term, taking different approaches to how launches are achieved, and examples are done by people like SpaceX and now Virgin, can start to bring that total cost down. So when you look at relatively small satellites, lightweight, multiple satellites on a launcher, and the cost of the launcher, and all of these things sort of have to balance out roughly, it does change the economic model very substantially. Combination, space is not the total solution. It's going to be satellites and various forms of unmanned vehicles, both airborne and seaborne, and it's that combination that's going to be good. Now, if you're surveying a small area, absolutely no doubt, UAV will give you better precision, weather permitting, will give you more rapid response. However, if you're surveying large areas, particularly if you want to survey somebody else's area, where they aren't so keen if you fly across them, then space and so open skies policy provides you with that opportunity. So it's not going to be one solution. It's going to be the synthesis of all of these in situ sensors, UAVs of whatever sort, and also spaceborne sensors. And then the vulnerability issue is an interesting one. One of the advantages of small satellites where you can distribute your sensors is that becomes much more of a challenge to crudely shoot down. Now, if you destroy the entire environment with a nuclear device or something, then of course that affects everybody. But small satellites are much quicker to replenish. So part of the strategy here is, first of all, make them more difficult to track, more difficult to disable, and then quicker to replenish in the event of somebody being antisocial. Right, I think I answered most of those.
Okay. Thank you very much. Perhaps I can get you at some point to have a word with our IT department about the 10-year-old laptop. Sir.
Mehmet Karakulucan from Istanbul Global Relations Forum. Following up on the vulnerability issue, given the last presence of assets now, especially the larger ones, how vulnerable are they to these small satellites used kinetically and aggressively? So, they don't, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And just if I divide that into parts, in terms of identifying a risk that, a small satellite being used for kinetic purpose, how good are we at that? Two, if it is approaching a big asset, how good are we at stopping it, destroying it, without causing debris at the wrong altitude? So I'm trying to sort of gauge the risk at that level, the vulnerability of our big assets to these small satellites.
Well, it's an interesting question, and the answer is it's not easy to give a blanket answer. If we're talking about satellites in a low Earth orbit, then in order to be able to approach those satellites and to interfere with them, you need to be able to make the orbits, bring the orbits together. That either means a dedicated launch, and of course this has been demonstrated by China, Russia, and also the US. So you can do a sort of direct ascent type of anti-satellite conjunction. If you put a satellite into orbit and then you decide you want to go walk over and hit another satellite, that generally requires, unless you've pre-planned it, it requires a significant amount of propulsive technique to be able to maneuver, and particularly if you want to do it fast. And small satellites can and do carry propulsion, but the amount of maneuverability they have is limited. So you have to be probably pretty careful to pre-plan it and time it, and then yes, of course, you can do so. But you can't just have very easily, unless you're very lucky, have a small satellite sitting in orbit and then suddenly decide to get right. If anybody saw the film Gravity, that was one of the major astrodynamical flaws in the thing. You can't just sort of go and zoom from one space station to another with a jetpack. There's not enough energy in it. So yes, it's possible. If you sort of planned ahead, yes, you can do it. But if you're just going to sit there and lurk and then zoom off, it's not very practical. The only other area where it is perhaps of more concern is if you put such a satellite into geostationary orbit, where you've actually then got a very thin belt of satellites, and you don't need anything like the same propulsive capability to go around. You know where they all are, they're all in that belt, and you can move around that belt fairly easily. So if you were to put a small satellite into that orbit, then that does become quite a significant risk. Did I catch all your questions?
No, how good, well, yes, you did part of it, but then how good are we at preempting if there were to be such an aggressive act? Can we identify it at the right time, and can we terminate it?
Well, we have colleagues in the audience who can better answer that than me, but I think the short answer is that there's and I was in the US last week where this question came up actually. There's a lot of effort going into monitoring satellites in increasingly small size and what they do, and interpreting what their intentions are likely to be. And therefore, I think there's we're probably in a fairly good position of spotting satellites when they start to do something unexpected. Then interfering with that or preventing it is a question that I'm not sure I can answer.
Okay, the gentleman in the front row and then right at the back.
ISS member Vipul Thakur. Sir Martin, in the event of our leaving EU, would SSTL and Surrey Space Centre would have more cooperation and joint project with non-EU countries like USA, China and India? And I got a very brief comment as well.
Can I answer the question?
Can we ask to deal with the question, please, because we've got other people.
Because otherwise I'll forget the comment.
Yeah.
Actually, we do, with one exception, we do very little business inside Europe. Nearly all our business, and I don't have a figure on it, but it's the majority of our business outside of Europe. You saw on that very quick map I showed you, majority are outside. The only big project we have currently in Europe is, which I didn't mention because brevity, is we're building the 22 navigation payloads for the European Galileo system, last of which is just about to be delivered. So that's been our biggest European project. Other than that, the majority of our activities have been in the US, in Canada, just starting in India, China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. Not so much in Europe. So if we were to Brexit, it wouldn't change our business model, not in the satellite side. I mean, there may be some economic, who knows, some papers get left and right, but there may be some economic impact, but not in terms of our business plan.
Thank you.
Gentleman right at the back there.
My name is Brian Wood from Office. You advocated developing sovereign conservation capability. So if you were in charge of delivering that, what would you require to have an effective conservation capability? In the future, is there sort of civilian occupation of space, system high resolution conservation? Do we need sovereign?
Very good question, and I think it depends on whether you believe that these new constellations will come into place, and if they do, whether you will have sufficient access to the data in a, shall I say, robust and transparent way. We already have access, of course, to the UK has access to data from other sources, so it's not that the UK is sort of left blind in any sense, but there is a subtle difference between having your own pair of binoculars and having somebody else give you pictures that they took through their pair of binoculars. You never quite know what the provenance of that data was and how it was handled and so on. And there may be times when the other owner of the binoculars wants to look in that direction for some reason. I'm sorry, it's just a fan of my machine. The owner may want to use his binoculars to look left, and for whatever reason he might want to look right, and you want to do it now. So I think the decision that needs to be made is, does having it doesn't need to be exotic, but having a modest sovereign capability add to the independence of knowledge and independence of action. And my feeling is, I think it would, because I think that it provides you with that ability to do things when you want to, knowing the provenance of that data and how you treat it.
I certainly testify from my own experience. About 15, 20 years ago, I would have given anything to have an independent deployable satellite capability for something that I was busy doing, and had no other way of verifying independently whether it was going according to plan or not. I can see the attraction.
And I think, to put it into perspective, we're probably talking of the cost of 1 or 2 tanks equivalent. Those that own tanks, I'm sorry, but to give you that sort of, it's of that thing. It's not. We're not going to have to invest $500 million into this.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yes.
Alan Smith, University College London. Given the catapult's emphasis on downstream applications, and given your comments about using Earth-based technologies as a source of capability in space, what do you think the role for space as a driver for innovation in its own right? I mean,
for those people who are developing technologies for space as a source of innovation. Do you think that still exists? Do you think that's still a major driver?
It does still exist, and I think it still exists very much in your domain of space science, because I think there's no doubt that science challenges will spin out capabilities which then get used in shall I say, more utilitarian areas. So I think it's very important that the UK maintains its space science research and space engineering research activities, because these are the things that we will then be using downstream. Some of the science instruments may not be used in the same way in the utilitarian area, but they will generate that necessary know-how. So I think that's absolutely key. What I do see, however, is whereas if you go back, I don't know, it's the 60s and 70s or whatever, where space was perhaps driving some of the technologies, partly because of the political imperative at the time. Now, I think what we see is that is reversed a little bit. I think it's the commercial development, the consumer actually is driving technology developments in many areas. Of course, there are military areas which are separate, but the consumer is driving much of this change, and space is parasitically taking advantage of that, if you like. So I think the balance perhaps has shifted, but we absolutely need to maintain our science base, because future sensors will often be driven by that science requirement.
Yes, I'm Derek Ballas from the LSE around the corner. My question goes back to something small that snuck into the conversation earlier about collision avoidance maneuvers. So the world of collision risk assessment and the decision whether to maneuver or not hinges on this world of space situational awareness, which is its own sort of big data modeling problem. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you think, in terms of your perspective, on the data sourcing and the nature of the infrastructure behind that system. So I don't know if you guys are doing the standard reliance on sort of JSPOC, sort of collision avoidance formulas. But there's now, for example, a guy in the House of Representatives who's talking about changing that from a military responsibility to something like the FAA in the United States, which again starts to ask this question of who ought to be responsible institutionally for this kind of a data problem, and then observation problem, and then how owner-operators and manufacturers are thinking about that.
Yeah, well, that's another deep topic, and one in which there's sort of several strands. Let me pick up a couple of strands. First of all, there's been a lot of debate about space traffic control. Military, civil, everybody is interested in making sure that their assets aren't damaged for different but equally urgent reasons. So space situational awareness is a critical area. It's one in which we have actually had a bit of involvement with our Canadian colleagues, a small satellite called Sapphire, looking specifically at space situational awareness. And it's something where we need to have more assets in order to generate better and more complete data. How that data is then handled and distributed and so forth is an open question. I'm not sure that I got any sort of meaningful comments on it other than we need it. I think.
Well, it brings up the other person's binoculars question, which is how trustworthy is the data? How trustworthy is the warning?
And that's why.
Threshold
and that's why I think it's very important to have multinational capabilities in this. So and that goes in a number of these areas, but in SSA in particular, I think there should be a multinational effort, and it's in everybody's interests, because not only do we just want to avoid damage, we want to avoid any misunderstandings of how satellite damage occurs. So I think it's very important that we have open, transparent information on this. Of course, some details will remain in one's pocket, but in general terms, it's in a common good to be able to have a decent space traffic control mechanism and a monitoring mechanism and a third-party fire and theft in orbit, because it's in nobody's interest if it happens. So, but it shouldn't just be sitting like the arguments that go the same way for GPS. Why does Europe have a Galileo system? It doesn't make sense to have infrastructure, essential infrastructure, dependent on one system, however nice the owner may be. So it's the same with SSA.
More questions? Yes.
Thank you, Tom from Bechtel. I may be showing my own ignorance here, but does the UK have any sovereign control over any launch capability? And if not, surely it's another part of the binoculars issue.
Indeed, and to the best of my knowledge, no, it doesn't. We have friends who will launch things for us, and again, this has been part of the debate, and it's one which again has changed a lot in the last 10 years. If you had talked about a UK sovereign launch capability 10 years ago, you'd probably be residing in the dungeon somewhere. But now, the combination of the opportunities offered by these small satellites, the opportunity to be able to launch responsive missions quickly, in principle, so that if you have an issue that pops up somewhere requires a certain set of sensors, which you don't have to have in orbit, there's mechanisms where you can get those now into orbit very rapidly or position them over certain areas very rapidly. But this requires not just rapid response to the satellite, you've also got to get the thing into orbit. And so the opportunity, not just from a commercial point of view, but from a defence point of view, of having a sovereign capability that can respond at the right scale. I mean, not talking about investing again billions here, and not starting from scratch with a new exotic rocket. Do it sensibly. Having that capability, having a launch site, having a sensible launcher with sensible capabilities to be able to provide that type of response is key. We don't have it, and I think it's something that now is being considered and supported.
Very quickly, where is there a particular logical place for such a capability? Correct. Geographically.
This is why I have to be careful, because this is a hot political potato at the moment, because I think there were like half a dozen folk that were coming up saying they've got the ideal place, and I haven't kept up to date with what the decision process is on that. But essentially, you want to have a launch site which, at our latitudes, has a clear path north or south without flying over any inhabited or grossly inhabited areas. So if you look at places which have a free flight up to the North Pole, essentially, then you can take your pick. There have been a number of those that have been put forward, but not all are obvious ones. So I think if you watch the news, then it will come out in due course. I'm not quite sure what the ministerial decision process is on this one. Colleagues here may better add to that. Of course, you know better.
But if they do, then they're not saying. No. Of course, this is on the record. Do you have any further questions? We've got time for just one more. Yes, sir. Yeah.
How easy is it to block data collection or data transmission on satellites? Again, I'm thinking of a conflict situation. Rather than escalating to destroying the assets, is it possible? Because I think actually it would be a nice way of sort of stopping the escalation. Technically, how viable?
Yes. And that can happen both overtly and inadvertently. And this is one of the reasons why I mentioned in passing so many things that we could be doing. Satellite-to-ground laser communications is going to be very useful for two reasons. First of all, we can have higher data rates. We can reuse essentially the frequency because you've got spatial diversity, and you've got a degree of privacy. And it's much more difficult to interfere with. Radio communication can be essentially jammed in one way or other, I'd say easily, but it's very vulnerable to that, and so considerable effort goes into making those systems robust.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I'll bring this to an end. And just to say, Martin, thank you very much for a presentation that is both informative and elegant in many ways, not least coming in almost exactly on the hour, which in terms of precision offers us a degree of encouragement and reassurance about UK space activities. But thank you very much for your time, and please join me in thanking Martin.